mode of representation. So it says it's the representation of the entire three worlds and not only of the gods or of yourselves. It gives you peace, entertainment, happiness, as well as beneficial advice based on the actions of high, low, and middle people. No wonder Natya Shastra was called the fifth Ved, but again, apart from this question of contesting worldviews and also this question of who gets the primacy in terms of the projection in this representational mode, I think the other thing that is very visible is the aesthetic finesse which is visible in every, in almost every stage of this text. And for example, if we are talking about content and the democratic space that it allowed for, and it created, I'm not just allowed for, it created it in a fundamental sense, then it also talks about the relationship between this text and the audience. So this sense of creating the text, the sense of representing the material for the audience, all these things have been, of course, taken care of in terms of great degree of sophistication. It will not be possible for us to capture the totality and the depth of this, because unless one reads a lot of these texts, it's very difficult to understand what is being talked about. But we are trying to foreground some important issues for you, and I think one can safely say that when we quote from the eulogy of Natya, and when Bharat Muni points out, based on the practice of that time, that drama brings rest and peace to persons afflicted by sorrow or fatigue or grief or helplessness, he is actually talking about a very rich format of drama which also allowed for complex viewing. And he feels that this aesthetic experience leads to all these virtues, all these, if I were to use an Aristotelian phrase, cathartic emotions. There is no art. This is very, very unique, again, very thought-provoking statement where he says there is no art, no knowledge, no yoga, no action that is not found in Natya. In other words, Natya is close to life. Natya has all the elements that life has, and of course life is in a flux, whereas drama gives it shape, form, and also refines that whole process of representation to provide aesthetic pleasure which stands on its own, and therefore it leads to the kind of release of internal sort of possibilities in the members of the audience also. After this, Bharat Muni of course went on to talk about the intricacies of the stage, and I really personally think it's absolutely marvelous to read this. I have tried to read it in the original, but I'm really not so well versed with Sanskrit, and therefore the translation also makes me feel quite excited. Because look at the description of the stage also. So it's both in terms of the space, the separated space which was used, and also the sense that that separated space is the space where imaginatively the theme would be constructed for the audience. So I would go back to that slide where he talks about the stage, different areas of the stage. He says, thus distinguish the area of performance could be either a house or a town or a garden, etc. According to the dialogue, one could see if it is an inside of a house or an outside locale, or the middle of a road, or a far off country. So again, it is really very pleasurable, as I'm sure you must have experienced it, and we experience this time and again when we go to theatre to see a play or a performance, that's the term he's used here, when you see even things that you're familiar with, their representation. And again, to have a range of this kind, it allows for the inside and the outside to be represented. And that's again, as I feel, really fascinating. It shows the kind of plays that were presented at that time and all the artistic interpretations and finesse that was necessary. In terms of plays, he has pointed out that there are two kinds of plays. One is lok dharmi, that is where the characters behave naturally. I think the parallel in terms of Western terminology would be perhaps realism, where there is life like a representational mode. Plays of Chekhov, plays of Ibsen would fall within this category. Natya dharmi, according to this definition, is dramatic, somewhat stylized. When characters are side by side and the speech of one is supposed not to be heard by the other, is natya dharmi. So, that is, there is an element of artifice involved in natya dharmi plays, because even if the person is speaking, the character is speaking, and if the playwright doesn't want this to be shared by the other character, so the other character would pretend that he or she hasn't listened to the dialogue, but the audience would be able to listen to it. So, you have soliloquy right here, which again is a fascinating aspect of the fact that theatre has always allowed for not only the external aspect of human beings, but the emotive inner life, and also the rapport between the performers and the audience is that of sharing secrets, sharing the inner insights, and that makes for a very, very finely textured understanding of this form. So, natya dharmi is of this kind, and then in this type, mountains, aerial chariots, weapons, etc., are given human forms. So, again, that's a delightful kind of possibility, because when human beings enact all these other inanimate objects, that also lends an interpretive charge to it, which of course through good performances adds to the delight in the perceptions of the audience. About the language issue, and again about the protagonist, the choice of protagonist, Sanskrit drama sort of has always been controversial, especially when contemporary theatre practitioners look at these ideas. I think many of these ideas really trouble them or make them feel worried about the worldview that this contained. But if we look at it in terms of the practice of that time and what it represented, it does show that this was a very hierarchy oriented world. But I think in terms of, again, the aesthetic representation, you do see that they did not exclude any character. So, within the hierarchy itself, or within a worldview which was saturated in caste divisions and also class divisions, you still see that it is inclusive, because it represents different kinds of characters. So, the kinds of 4 languages that are mentioned, and it is pointed out that though the languages themselves are Sanskrit and Prakrit, these 4 kinds are only the intonations. And I really am not an expert on this, but I just thought I should mention this, because from the point of view of hybridity that we have talked about in module 1 and 2, in terms of contemporary writers, and this whole issue of hybridity, which shows the way people use multiple languages, they mix and match, and also are very expressive and inventive in using language. I think this holds some interest for us. So, Ati Bhasha is intended for gods, Arya Bhasha is intended for the kings, Jati bhasha is various kinds mixed with foreign words, refined or rustic. And Jatyantari bhasha is for rustics, foresters, animals and birds. So, you remember human beings acting as animals and birds, they would also use this language. Characters in disguise, sramanas, ascetics, mendicants should use prakrit. Similarly, children, persons possessed by evil spirits, women, persons of low birth, intoxicated persons must also use prakrit. But itinerant recluses, sages, Buddhists, learned Brahmins and other qualified in the knowledge of the Vedas should speak Sanskrit. As I said, this has been a bone of contention, and at the same time it does show a sort of inclusive outlook in terms of not leaving out any kind of person from this representational enterprise. This goes on to talk about queens, courtesans, artisans under special circumstances, and if the occasion demands may also speak Sanskrit. For example, and this is rather interesting, that for the queen she is allowed to speak Sanskrit. Why? Because the queen may have to know matters connected with war and peace, with the movements of planets and stars, or cries of birds, foreboding good or evil results. So, she must speak Sanskrit. I found it very interesting that what is expected of the queen is that she would know about power politics, but she would also be scientifically aware. She would be aware of the movements of planets and stars, but also ecologically connected and also very intuitive in terms of sense of good or evil. That sort of would emerge in any situation. If I were you, I would pick up this sentence and try and figure out if I could write a play imagining such a possibility. Well, Bharat Muni went on to talk about 10 varieties of plays, and what we have done here is not to really talk about the 10 kinds of plays, but only pick up 2, that is Natak and Bhan. Natak because we feel that it has all the propensities of portraying conflict and also the sort of ups and downs, the upheavals within the text in terms of characters and how they are transformed, and Bhan because Bhan is a monologic form. So, let us see how we can make sense of this material. So, that is why as I pointed out that although on the one hand we are looking at this text from Bharat Muni mainly in order to understand what the practice of that historical period, but we are also interested in extrapolating and also interested in understanding how at different points in time Indian theatre practitioners as well as Western theatre practitioners have taken their inspiration from the ideas contained in Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra. So, of course, as I said, we are not looking at all the 10 varieties, we are only looking at Natak and Bhan. And I have mentioned 10 to 47 because in this edition that we are using, they have pointed out how in these lines Bharat Muni has explained what Natak is all about. So, it is kind of almost in a prescriptive mode, but the characteristics of Natak have been described, and similarly Bhan has been described. Now, one way of dealing with this we thought was to not really look at the text from Bharat Muni, but actually look at a great example of Natak from that time, and that is Kalidas's Shakuntalam. Now, of course, this picture that we have chosen for you we do feel that this doesn't perhaps fully imagine Kalidas, and there are of course lots and lots of images of Kavi Kalidas that begin to crop up in one's consciousness based on either cinematic representation or paintings one may have seen. But I think more needs to be done on this, because we couldn't quite find something that really gripped our attention the way the iconic pictures of Kabir earlier had gripped our attention, and they completely represent the poet's world. Here I am not so sure, but so what we have done is to use Shakuntalam and also share the features of Natak in that process. What are the features of Natak, and therefore what is the relevance of this form, and how have modern practitioners been inspired and influenced by this form in general, and what are the responses to this text in particular. So now Shakuntalam, when it is translated, it reads like a different text in different translation. This particular translation that we have used, and it's not that we evaluated every translation and decided on this particular translation. It just so happens that I've always been exposed to this particular translation by Arthur Ryder. So this is the one that translates the title as "Of Shakuntala, Recognized by a Token." In other translations, it is the ring which is mentioned. This particular play, if you look at the illustration, the second illustration, this is from Raja Ravi Verma and his famous painting of Shakuntala. Again, this is a sort of almost an iconic scene. But what is really very interesting about this form of drama is the fact that although there is a central conflict, there is also a sense of, I would say, rise and fall in the destiny of the characters. But at the same time, it also revolves around the idea of a mood or a rasa which is dominant. In Shakuntalam is Shrangar Ras which is dominant, and also Viraha is also part of this, the mood that is created. So the mood is created partly, of course, through the theme, but also there are songs, the interpretive songs that are constantly, generated by the playwright. The story of Shakuntala is from the Mahabharata, and Kalidas actually sort of had a different take on the story. The story briefly is about Shakuntala, who lived in a hermitage, and how Dushyant, the king, went there and he was attracted by her. And so this first part, the first portrayal that is before you, it deals with Shakuntala and her friends who are totally immersed in the landscape of the hermitage. She's projected almost like nature's child. And so let's see what else in terms of the pictures first, and then I'll maybe read a few lines from the text. The second picture before you is that of Shakuntala, who after she falls in love with Dushyant, and they actually have a Gandharva Vivah, that means a sort of contract between the two individuals to remain married. He goes back to his court, and meanwhile Shakuntala has been cursed that she would not, the person she is married to would forget her. And so by the time she goes to the court and tell Dushyant that she is going to have a child, Dushyant has forgotten her. So this particular painting, it shows the mood of Viraha in Shakuntala. what I think may be useful is to notice that plays of this variety, when they were presented at that time, they also had a sort of device by which, or not device, but the convention that it had to start with a benediction. So, it starts with a prayer for the well-being of the audience, which is what Shakuntalam also starts with, and it also shows the conversations between the stage director, actress and director in this text. And I again, the reason I want to foreground this very briefly is because this device shows a very different outlook towards theatre. There is no attempt to create the illusion of reality in the way modern, Western, realistic drama tried to create an illusion of reality. So, you had to suspend your disbelief and then you went to see drama. Here, the story is already quite well known based on the epic, which was also part of the oral tradition. So, people, the audience were at that time very, very well versed with the story of Shakuntala and Dushyant, and a variation that they had heard or may have heard at that time through oral narratives. And so, there was no great suspense about the story. And in addition, then there is this playful banter between the people involved in producing this play. And I would actually like to read it from the point of view of the actress here, because I notice in this, defined as a prologue, that the actress is very keen on sort of satisfying whatever the stage director and the director asks her to. And so, this is how it starts. After the prayer, he says, "Madam, if you are ready, pray come here." Enter an actress and she says, "Here I am, sir, what am I to do?" And he says, "Our audience is very discriminating and we are to offer them a play called Shakuntala and the Ring of Recognition, written by the famous Kalidas. Every member of the cast must be on his mettle." And then he says, "Okay," she says, "what do you want me to do?" And he says, "Okay, you must sing something to please the ears of the audience." So, starts with a song about the season of spring, which sort of brings in new life and so on and so forth. And so, it starts with a song, and then again there is a bit of a banter between these. Now, this may seem innocuous to you if you are not familiar with theatre traditions, or it may seem innocuous if you are familiar with this tradition, both ways. But actually, this has had profound impact on many, many theatre practitioners in India and the West, because this whole idea of beginning to talk to the audience, I think that has enchanted playwrights quite a bit, because it breaks certain barriers. It sort of also includes the audience directly in the worldview of the writer, the sense of what is being explored. They become, closer. There is a closer bond between all the sides, so to say. So, this is how the play begins, and we will talk about this format later on. And so, please take note of this convention of prayer followed by a banter between the directors, actors, the sutradhar is there many times, and so on and so forth. There are only two small parts that have been identified for sharing with you. One is in Act 1, and I think this particular scene is depicted in the Raja Ravi Verma painting also, the first one, with Shakuntala and her friends, and you also see another woman, woman monk in the background. That contrast is also very interesting. But I think this is the line that unfolds in that hermitage, where actually already the friends are talking to each other, and it is shown that Shakuntala has very intimate sense of connection with every plant, every bird, every animal, every human being in that hermitage. So she's very deeply connected child of that hermitage. And she talks to Priyambada, her friend, and preceding the lines that I have selected, Shakuntala says, and this will really evoke a lot of I think aesthetic pleasure if you read it in the original. But here she says in translation, "Oh girls, that mango tree is trying to tell me something with his branches that move in the wind like fingers. I must go and see him." And she does so. And Priyambada, her friend, says, "There, Shakuntala, stand right where you are a minute." And Shakuntala says, "Why?" Priyambada, "When I see you there, it looks as if a vine were clinging to the mango tree." And Shakuntala says, "I see why they call you the flatterer." And the king, who's eavesdropping, he says, "But the flattery is true." And the lines that I have chosen here from Act 1, they actually are uttered by Dushyant, who has come to the hermitage while he is on a hunt, and he chances on this hermitage, and then he eavesdrops. And he says, "Her arms are tender shoots, her lips are blossoms red and warm. Bewitching youth begins to flower in beauty on her form." So this first part is, these lines, they are seen from the sort of male gaze of King Dushyant, and I like to contrast it with the voice of Shakuntala in the 5th act, where actually Dushyant refuses to recognize Shakuntala. And so I think it has a particular title. It is called Shakuntala's Rejection, a very harsh term and a harsh experience for Shakuntala, where the king, after he listens to this claim that she is a wife, he has forgotten this, and these are the lines that I'd like to read to you to project Shakuntala's agony. Again, think of the second painting, and this is the kind of situation perhaps which will help you understand the emotions on the face of Shakuntala and her friends. Act 5, Shakuntala's rejection, and the king listening with anxious suspicion. What is this insinuation? And Shakuntala to herself. It's very interesting to note that this device of talking to herself has been used very extensively in this particular act, where she's almost voiceless. She's almost heavy with the child and with grief. She's burdened, she's highly burdened, because there is this sense of uncertainty as to what would happen to her. But when she confronts the situation and Dushyant rejects her completely, this is what she says to herself: "Oh, so haughty and so slanderous." And the reason again I think this is interesting is because on the one hand, one can see that in a natak, the king is the protagonist, and it is the action of the king which is given precedence over the action of other characters, although the play is called Shakuntala. So I think Kalidas was interested in foregrounding Shakuntala, but he also was really, it's not clear whether he was looking at her as a victim, or he was also trying to see the kind of grief that she suffered. I think the text allows for complex reading, and in that sense what Shakuntala says to herself becomes very important, because she doesn't lose her personhood at all. And so she's sort of angry, and she says, how so haughty and so slanderous. And then later on, the king, as he listens to her outburst, he begins to feel admiration for her. So he doesn't remember because of the curse. Now, of course, the curse Does it show that this was an external reason because of which Dushyant forgot her, or was it because of arrogance of power which allowed him to play with the lives of people? That's not clear, but also it's subject to one's interpretation. But at the same time, he begins to feel admiration for her, because this is what he says now to himself. And the reason he says this to himself is because publicly he's already taken a stance that she doesn't belong to him and he has no connection with Shakuntala. So now he says to himself, but her anger is free from coquetry because she has lived in the forest. See? So again, this living in the forest is associated with a state of innocence where the person is not corrupted by the manipulations of the city life, the court life in particular, and therefore, he sort of is greatly attracted by this honesty that he can sense in her outpouring, because this absolutely comes from her soul and heart. Now Shakuntala says, well, I had my way, I trusted a king and put myself in his hands. He had a honey face and a heart of stone. It's really a very strong contrasting image. And then she breaks down, she covers her face with a dress and weeps. Later on in this scene, it is again a very, very interesting situation where you instead of the Sita like situation where the earth opens and Sita sort of decides to go back to the earth mother, here Shakuntala is actually lifted by an aerial figure, and in that sense again this is a very mythological kind of situation, but it also suggests to everybody who's present there that Shakuntala is an honest woman. What she's saying is truth, and it's not an act of manipulation at all. And this is on page 61 when the voices behind the scenes are crying out and saying, a miracle, and the king is listening. What does this mean? And the chaplain says, Your Majesty, a wonderful thing has happened. And he says, what? When Kanwa's pupils had departed, she tossed her arms, bemoaned her plight, accused her crushing fate. And then the king says, and the chaplain says, before our eyes a heavenly light in woman's form, but shining bright, seized her and vanished straight. All betray astonishment. So, again, these plays, these mythic or mythological portrayals, they allow for a fresh way of interpretation of these weighty themes, because the iconic plays and the characters and the situations of conflict that are portrayed, they have become part of our national imagination. We'll talk about that a little later. So this is the great Kalidas, who also, I think, whose play represents Natak at its best. Prachikatikam by Shudrak is another play that later on we'll talk about. But at this point, let us shift to the Bhan, because that's another variety of drama, and we feel particularly gripped by it from the perspective of this course on creativity and creative writing, because in our attempt to teach plot and character, we are also trying to sort of find out writing exercises for students who have started taking writing work seriously, to figure out how they can locate their sense of selfhood while undertaking initial stages of writing in a somewhat self-conscious manner. We do feel that the efficacy of monologue as a preliminary writing exercise is, I think, fairly well established from our point of view. And of course, soliloquy and aside also within a play are forms of that are other forms of internal monologues that we are also equally interested in. But what Bhan does is to really locate the presence of monologue as a full-fledged artistic form, and therefore let's look at what Bharat Muni had to say about Bhan, because if he gave it the status of a full-fledged form, what does it contain? That has been the question that for the last 1 month or so we've been pursuing, I think a little longer than that. So, Bhan is to be, he says, acted by one person in one act. It shall include many or various episodes and plenty of movements. It can be autobiographical or it can be fictional. Very interesting from the point of view of writing exercises, because in the early stages of writing, this difference between the autobiographical and the fictional is very, very hard to sustain for many of the students. So, then it is described, this quality of fictionality, when it refers to the acts of another person, the actor on the stage must carry on a dialogue with the other one by Akash Bhashita, speaking face up with one who is off the stage. So, it's like it's a monologue, but there is an imagined person that the protagonist could be talking to. That's one form. The other is purely autobiographical, and in that sense is close to the soliloquy, but the soliloquy, you know, comes in sporadically, whereas here the focus would be completely on a single point of view. So, I think more than this, at this point in time, we will not be able to say about Bhan as an art form, because we have been trying to locate examples, and Shudrak along with Mrichakatikam had published a Bhan, and you know, when we were sort of trying to locate Bhan, we were very lucky to have the help of Professor Ram Subramanian, who finally put us in touch with a very eminent scholar of Sanskrit from Bangalore, Dr. Ganesh, and Dr. Ganesh has helped us locate a text that was published in 1960 with 4 Bhans there. So, what we decided is that, you know, since we really hadn't read any of these Bhans ourselves, although we think that it has great potential as an art form, and also it has significance for creative writing courses where students are struggling with this notion of the self and the other in variety of ways. I think we would still try and explore these examples, but Dr. Ganesh Ashtabadhani, he gave us some sense of what it's all about. We had posed these questions to him yesterday when we were able to get in touch with him, and you know, these are the questions that he tried to help us understand. We won't report everything here, except to say that, you know, I think talking to him was wonderful, because he took our questions very seriously, and he will help us locate these 4 Bhans. So, the questions that we had were related to the fact of this issue of language. If this is a standalone piece, was it in Sanskrit or Prakrit? That was one question. The other question was related to the character type, because according to Bharat Muni, it projected either a rogue or a gallant. So, my question to him yesterday was related to the difference between the characters in a Bhan and Vidushak, for example, from Sanskrit drama, who always subverts the main plot, who also is seen as a lower character, but he also has a sharp satirical gaze. And I think his response was that this is slightly different, and also these are sort of perhaps meant for a refined audience, and therefore the character spoke a mix of Sanskrit and Prakrit, and especially in the fictional form, if they were talking to somebody who was in the category where the Prakrit had to be spoken, then Prakrit was used by this character. And in other words, there is greater degree of sophistication in the way the characters are projected. These are not just reactive. Vidusha is a reactive figure. That's the way I figured it out. And in that sense, he reacts to the, fallible nature of the powerful figures around him. That happens actually even in Shakuntalam, that the fishermen who actually catch fish which contains the ring of Shakuntala, they also have fairly cutting things to say about the upper classes. So that's why I think it allows for complex seeing. But here in this case, another issue that I really want to resolve is in terms of the democratic space which is used by the character and by the writer in this format. So a writer like Shudrak, why did he feel compelled to write Han? Finally, does it allow for introspection, this form? Does it allow for introspection by the protagonist? So then these are the questions that we pose to Dr. Ganesh Ashtavadhani, but I think we will also wait to read and maybe talk to him again and report back to you when we find the material. What we have been trying to do when we look back at the great ancient forms which have actually triggered the discourses within each culture of what constitutes representational forms, we are really looking at the interacting continuum of the classical, the folk and the modern, because all of these, we have already talked about it at length earlier, there is such a sense of connection. And in that sense, what I would like to sort of point out to you again is the fact that this continuum also contains seeds of creativity. Our earlier preoccupation with diversity of languages and aesthetic forms, we have mentioned, we look at it seriously because these animate the Indian imagination. And for a creative outlook, even if, let's say, everything doesn't work out for you when you read it, but for a creative outlook, I think there is need for alertness towards our own complex cross currents. And to just give you some idea about what a tremendous sense of flow this is all about, it may be useful to talk about the hybridity of tamasha, a performative form in Maharashtra which draws from Bhan. So it sort of draws directly from Bhan, which we have been talking about as a monologic form, but what it has done is to add also some other forms. So the hybridity consists of a combination of Bhan, Prahasan, Kathak, Dashavatar, etc., to create new mode of public presentation.